What if I told you that the greatest queen of the Middle Ages, a woman celebrated as a proto-feminist icon, a brilliant politician, and the mother of kings, harbored a secret so dark, so viscerally horrifying, it belongs more to a Gothic nightmare than a history book? We are taught to remember Eleanor of Aquitaine as a beacon of power and intelligence in a brutal, male-dominated world. She was the queen of two global superpowers, France and then England. She gave birth to Richard the Lionheart and the infamous King John. Her life was a masterclass in survival and political maneuvering. But what if the official story, the polished tale of courtly intrigue, is a carefully constructed lie, designed to hide a final, gruesome chapter? There is a legend, a story whispered in the darkest corners of medieval history, a tale that was deemed too shocking for the official chronicles. It's a story of a love so passionate it curdled into a hatred so profound it defied death itself. It is the story of a dying king's last, twisted act of possession, and a queen's ultimate, stomach-turning act of defiance. This is the tale of the golden goblet, the embalmed heart, and the queen who, according to the whispers, was forced to ritually consume the very man who had imprisoned her. If you are ready to peel back the pristine pages of history and stare into the abyss of royal obsession, hit that subscribe button. Because you are about to learn the story of how a broken heart became a terrifying weapon. To understand the darkness that would later consume her, you must first understand the light from which she was forged. Eleanor was not a product of the cold, grey north. She was a creature of the south, a firebird from the sun-drenched duchy of Aquitaine. Imagine a land entirely different from the rest of France. Aquitaine was a realm of wine-dark rivers, sprawling vineyards, and a culture of fierce independence. It was the birthplace of the troubadours, of courtly love, where poetry was a weapon and women were not just seen but celebrated. This was Eleanor's inheritance. She wasn't just a duchess, she was the living embodiment of this vibrant, passionate world. From a young age, she was educated as a ruler, not a wife. She rode, she hunted, she studied Latin and music, she learned the art of strategy and diplomacy. While other noble girls were learning needlepoint, Eleanor was learning how to command the loyalty of armies. She was raised to be a lioness, not a lamb. Her spirit was as vast and untamed as the lands she was to inherit. This upbringing instilled in her an unshakable belief in her own authority and a thirst for a life of passion and meaning, a dangerous combination for any woman in the 12th century. When her father died, she, at the tender age of 15, became the single most powerful and desirable heiress in all of Europe. A firebird, ready to take flight, unaware she was about to be caged. The man who would become her cage was Louis VII, King of France. And he was everything Eleanor was not. If she was fire, he was ice. If she was a roaring symphony, he was the silent, echoing prayer of a monastery. Louis was never meant to be king. His older brother, Philip, was the heir, the confident, boisterous future of the Capetian dynasty. Louis was the second son, destined for the church. He grew up in the hallowed, shadowy halls of the cloister, his days governed by bells, prayers, and the scent of cold stone and incense. His mind was shaped by piety, humility, and a deep-seated guilt for the sins of the world. He was quiet, introspective, and utterly unprepared for the brutalities of a throne. Then, fate intervened with cruel randomness. His brother Philip was killed in a freak riding accident, thrown from his horse after it was spooked by a pig in the streets of Paris. In an instant, the gentle, pious Louis was ripped from the monastery and thrust onto the throne of France. The crown sat upon his head not as a symbol of power, but as a heavy, torturous penance. He was a man burdened by a destiny he never wanted, haunted by the ghost of the brother he was never meant to replace. It was this man, a monk in king's clothing, who was now contractually bound to marry the most vibrant, worldly, and dangerously alive woman in Christendom. The collision was inevitable. The explosion would shake the foundations of Europe. Their marriage was a spectacular paradox. On the one hand, there was an undeniable and intense physical attraction. The sheer force of their opposing natures created a volatile, passionate chemistry that, for a time, masked the chasm that lay between their souls. But the daily reality of their union was a constant, grinding war of cultures and personalities. Eleanor arrived in Paris and was immediately suffocated. The northern court was a place of rigid etiquette, conservative dress, and somber piety. It was a world of grey stone and even greyer moods, a stark contrast to the colorful, expressive courts of her homeland. She tried to bring the light of the South with her, introducing poetry, music, and a more relaxed courtly life. But to Louis and his grim-faced advisers, her vibrancy looked like frivolity, her intelligence like arrogance, and her confidence like a sinful lack of modesty. For Louis, living with Eleanor was a constant spiritual trial. He was a man who prayed for hours, fasted, and wore a hair shirt beneath his royal robes to mortify his own flesh. He was married to a woman who reveled in the beauty of the world, who loved fine silks, spirited debate, and the company of charismatic artists. He saw her as a beautiful temptation sent to test his piety, a constant reminder of the worldly pleasures he felt he should renounce. A chasm of ice and silence had opened between them, bridged only by the formal duties of the royal bedchamber. She was a queen with no power, a wife with no partner, a firebird trapped in a cage of gilded piety. She needed to escape, and soon, the entire Christian world would give her the chance. In 1147, a wave of religious fervor swept across Europe. The Second Crusade was called by the Pope, a grand military campaign to reclaim Christian territories in the Holy Land. For Louis, this was a divine opportunity. He was still haunted by a past sin, an event where his army had burned a church, killing over 1,000 civilians who had taken refuge inside. He saw the crusade as his path to spiritual redemption, a holy pilgrimage to wash the blood from his hands and his soul. For Eleanor, the crusade was something else entirely. It was a chance to breathe. It was an escape from the suffocating confines of the Parisian court, a chance to be the ruler she was raised to be, not the decorative wife she had become. Against all tradition and the strenuous objections of his advisers, Eleanor announced that she would be joining the crusade. This was a scandal of epic proportions. Queens did not go to war. They stayed home, managed the household, and prayed for their husband's safe return. But Eleanor was not just a queen, she was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. She summoned her own vassals, her own knights, who were loyal to her, not to the French crown. She rode out at the head of her own army, a warrior queen ready to reclaim her destiny on the battlefields of the East. It was an act of breathtaking defiance that cemented her legendary status, but it would also be the catalyst that would utterly and irrevocably destroy her marriage. The journey to the Holy Land was a grueling, 2,000-mile ordeal that exposed the fatal flaws in Louis's character and his marriage. The crusade was a logistical nightmare. The massive army of soldiers, nobles, and pilgrims was ravaged by starvation, disease, and the punishing terrain of Eastern Europe and Anatolia. Through it all, Eleanor proved to be a capable and pragmatic leader. She managed her own troops with skill, and ensured they were better supplied than the rest of the French army. Louis, by contrast, proved to be a disastrous military commander. He was indecisive, trusting incompetent advisers and seeing every setback not as a tactical problem to be solved, but as a sign of God's displeasure. While Eleanor was trying to strategize, Louis was praying. While her troops marched with discipline, his fell into disarray. The simmering resentment between them boiled over into open contempt. In front of the entire army, Eleanor would openly question her husband's commands, offering her own, superior strategies. The soldiers, particularly those from her native Aquitaine, saw her strength and his weakness. They began to look to her for leadership, openly mocking the monk king who was leading them to their deaths. For Louis, this was a humiliation on an unimaginable scale. His wife was not only usurping his authority as a husband, but his authority as a king and a commander. Every day on that long bloody road, his love for her curdled a little more into a poison of bitter resentment. He was losing control, not just of the crusade, but of his wife. The breaking point came when the beleaguered army finally staggered into the magnificent city of Antioch. For Eleanor, it was like a homecoming. The city was ruled by her beloved uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, a man who embodied everything she missed about the South. He was handsome, charismatic, a brilliant military mind, and a patron of the arts. He was, in essence, everything Louis was not. Eleanor and Raymond were overjoyed to be reunited. They spent their days in deep conversation, laughing, strategizing, and speaking in their native Aquitaine dialect, a language Louis could not understand. They were family, two brilliant minds connecting in a time of crisis. But to the paranoid and humiliated Louis, it looked like something else entirely. Vicious rumors, likely fanned by Louis's own advisers, began to spread through the camp like a plague. The Queen and her uncle were too close. Their long, private meetings were not about military strategy, but about an illicit, incestuous affair. The whispers grew into a roar. Louis, already insecure and overwhelmed, became consumed by a fever of jealousy. He saw betrayal in every shared glance, conspiracy in every shared laugh. Raymond proposed a sound military plan to attack a key enemy stronghold, a plan Eleanor passionately supported. But Louis, blinded by his personal fury, refused. He saw it as a plot by his wife and her lover to gain glory for themselves. In a fit of righteous rage, he effectively sabotaged the entire purpose of the crusade, commanding the army to leave Antioch at once. He dragged Eleanor away from her uncle, away from the only place she had felt alive in years, and began the long, miserable journey home. The voyage back to France was not a journey, it was a funeral procession for their marriage. The passion, the arguments, the engagement, all of it was gone, replaced by a profound and chilling silence. They traveled on separate ships, inhabiting separate worlds. They were no longer husband and wife, they were enemies, bound together by a crown and a sacrament they both now despised. For Eleanor, this was the ultimate betrayal. Her husband had publicly shamed her, accused her of the most heinous of sins, and prioritized his own wounded pride over the success of their holy mission. He had shown himself to be not just a poor king, but a weak and petty man. For Louis, Eleanor was the embodiment of his failure. She was the serpent in his garden, the symbol of the worldly temptation that had led his crusade, and his soul, to ruin. When they finally returned to Paris, the court they came back to was a tomb. The vibrant life Eleanor had once tried to inject into it was gone. She was now a prisoner in all but name. Watched, monitored, and isolated, she lived in a gilded cage, while her husband's resentment festered. She begged the Pope for an annulment, famously declaring the line that would echo through history: "I thought I had married a king, but I find I have married a monk." The marriage was a corpse, and the entire kingdom was forced to endure the stench of its decay. For years, Louis refused to let her go. Freeing Eleanor meant she would take Aquitaine with her, a loss of territory and power the French crown could not afford. More than that, his pride could not endure it. The thought of her marrying another man, of finding the happiness and partnership she never had with him, was a torment he could not bear. So he kept her locked in their loveless union, a daily, living reminder of his own monumental failure. During this time, Louis's health began to fail. The disastrous crusade, the public humiliation, and the years of living in a state of cold war with his own wife had taken their toll. His body weakened, and his mind, already prone to religious melancholy, became fixated on a single all-consuming obsession: Eleanor. He saw her not as a person, but as a possession that had been tainted. In his fevered imagination, her alleged betrayal in Antioch became the central sin of his life, the source of all his misery. As he lay dying, he wasn't concerned with the succession of his kingdom or the salvation of his soul. He was consumed with a dark and twisted desire for a final, posthumous victory over the woman who had rejected him. He began to devise a plan, a final act of psychological torture so grotesque, so profoundly personal, that it would bind her to him forever, even from beyond the grave. This is where recorded history ends and the chilling legend begins. As King Louis VII lay on his deathbed, he summoned his most loyal ministers and, in front of a horrified Queen Eleanor, he delivered his final command, his last will and testament of hate. He declared that his love for her had been so pure, so absolute, that he could not bear for his heart to be separated from her even in death. It was a declaration coated in the language of courtly love, but its intent was pure poison. He commanded that upon his death, his heart was to be expertly excised from his chest. It was not to be buried with his body. Instead, it was to be embalmed in the finest spiced wine, placed within a magnificent, custom-made golden goblet, and presented to his loving queen. But that was not all. He then forced Eleanor to swear a sacred oath on a holy relic, in front of the entire court. To prove her undying love and to atone for her perceived sins, she was to perform a daily ritual for 1 full year after his death. Every evening, she was to drink from the golden goblet, symbolically partaking of his love and his essence. She was to consume him, piece by piece, day by day. It was a monstrous parody of the Catholic Eucharist, a sacrament of obsession. If she refused, she would be breaking a sacred deathbed oath, branding herself a faithless monster in the eyes of God and all Christendom. It was the perfect trap. Louis died, and his horrific command was carried out. The royal surgeons performed their grim task, and a golden goblet, containing the wine-soaked heart of the dead king, was presented to the widowed queen. The court watched, a silent assembly of horrified voyeurs. Her enemies watched, eager to see her break. Her friends watched, helpless to intervene. According to the legend, Eleanor, trapped by her oath, began the ritual. Every evening, in a silent, solemn ceremony, a servant would present her with a cold, heavy goblet, and she would raise it to her lips. One can only imagine the psychological torment of that act. To drink from that chalice was to swallow her own humiliation, to consume the essence of her jailer, to partake in a ritual designed to break her spirit. Each sip was an act of submission, a reminder of his final, suffocating control. For weeks, she endured it. She performed the ritual with the cold, regal composure that had defined her entire life. She showed no emotion, no weakness. But beneath the stoic facade, the lioness was gathering her strength. She was not just enduring the punishment, she was plotting her escape. This daily act of horror was not breaking her. It was forging her rage into a weapon of tempered steel. She was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to not just end the ritual, but to obliterate its memory. The moment finally came. One evening, as the court assembled for the grim spectacle, Eleanor was presented with the golden goblet. She took it in her hands. The room was silent, expectant. She raised it, not to her lips, but high in the air. For a long moment, she held it there, her eyes sweeping across the faces of the nobles who had watched her torment. And then, with a cry of defiance that shattered years of forced silence, she hurled the golden goblet to the stone floor. It landed with a deafening crash, a final, violent punctuation mark on her life as Queen of France. The spell was broken. The curse was lifted. She turned her back on the mess, on the court, on the ghost of her monk king, and walked out, a free woman. Her revenge was swift and absolute. Within 8 weeks, she was married again, this time to the young, dynamic, and ambitious Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy. By marrying him, she did not just find a new husband, she created a new world order. Her vast lands of Aquitaine were now joined with his, and when he was crowned King Henry II of England 2 years later, their combined territories formed the Angevin Empire, a massive, sprawling superpower that dwarfed the Kingdom of France. She gave her new husband sons, including a new Lionheart to rule. She had not only escaped her cage, she had forged an empire that would become her first husband's greatest enemy. The legend of the goblet, whether true or not, serves as a powerful, terrifying metaphor. Eleanor of Aquitaine had to ritually consume and then violently destroy her past in order to rise from its ashes, not just as a survivor, but as the most powerful and formidable woman of her age.